Yeah,
if you
see,
wait
yeah,
a little
then
longer,
Jeremy's.
can we go after we get started? Because I have to do some transition stuff. I think.
Good morning. Welcome to KOH. I don't like having to do much stuff, so this is a great opportunity. I won't have to because I'm going to introduce a speaker to you that you all know. He has presented to us many times before. In fact, if memory serves, and of course, my memory really spans about 2 hours prior to the present. But if it serves, then our guest today, Nathan Weisberg, has been addressing Mosaic law since he was about this high. So this, I don't know, I'm not going to ask how old he is, but that could have been as much as 20 years ago, I think, when he first addressed us. This would have been this would have been over in the chapel. So as I say, he needs no introduction. So here's the introduction. Nate Weisberg, who is going to speak to us about slaves, serfs, and servants. I believe this is related to his master's thesis that he delivered to that great local institution, California State University of Sacramento. Nate, take it.
Thank you. We'll use that when people ask questions. Hello. Hello. Good morning. Unfortunately, this isn't from my master's thesis, but the genesis, the seed of this talk began a few years ago when I gave a drasha at Knesset Israel about the question of why there are rules permitting slavery in the Torah, and talked about it and compared slavery in the Torah to slavery in other contexts. And after it was over, a congregant came up to me and said that was very interesting, but you're completely wrong because slavery isn't allowed in the Torah. This isn't slavery at all. And so this got me thinking about the question really of what is slavery? What is slavery, and how do we understand what slavery is, and how do we understand the rules that appear in the Torah permitting the purchase and sale of human beings? I'm not here today to try and answer moral questions about this, what God was thinking. I'm not here to try and defend it. But I am here to try and look at these rules in the Torah and where they fit into world history, how they compare to other forms of labor in the ancient Near East, and just how they compare to, well, slavery, serfdom, and servitude elsewhere in the world over the past few thousand years. So our key question is this: what is slavery? I want you to keep that question in mind as we go through this talk. And right now, does anyone have an answer for me? What is slavery? How do we define this? If we're to involuntary, thank you, Dwight. So it's involuntary, you're not there willingly. Anyone else have another definition for slavery? Yeah. You have no agency. Thank you, Devora. So you've got no agency. You're there involuntarily. Any other definitions? Because if we're going to decide whether what's in the Torah is slavery or not, we have to have a good idea of what it is. Forced. Thank you. Yep, it's forced. There's coercion involved. I like all these definitions. They're good ones. So historians tend to, oops, let me go back. Historians tend to group labor loosely under the terms you've got unfree labor, semi-free labor, and you've got free labor. And the difference between these can be hard to define. Sometimes it's arbitrary. For the purpose of this talk, I am defining unfree labor, which includes but is not limited to slavery. I'm saying in unfree labor, you can't quit, and you either aren't paid or you aren't paid to a meaningful degree. Because occasionally you encounter people who are saying, well, this isn't slavery. We're paying them, but they're not free to leave and they're not being paid very much. And you start to ask what's really the difference. And in free labor, your presence is voluntary and you receive what you, or someone at least, considers to be a fair compensation for your work. Does this make sense as a definition? I'm seeing some nodding heads. Good, good, good. Semi-free labor is harder to define, but we'll get into that. Mostly, I'm going to be using this graph in our talk. On one end, we've got unfree. On the other end, we've got free. In the middle, we've got semi-free. And I want to emphasize here that labor, it can fall like here, right? It doesn't have to be in one of the three. We can put the different types of labor we talk about in different places. This makes sense? You guys are following? Cool. I'm going to give you some examples of different types of labor from throughout human history, from different parts of the world, and you're going to tell me, and if you're watching this on Zoom, then you can, where's the camera? I'm trying to face the camera. There's the camera. And if you're watching this on Zoom, then you can type a comment into the chat. If you're here in person, you can raise your hand, and we'll try and get a microphone to you, so you can give us your opinion. You'll tell me where on that graph you think that this kind of labor falls. So I thought we'll start with an easy one that you guys are all familiar with. Modern wage labor like we have in the 20th century in most of the developed world. You agree to sign a contract with an employer. Either side can end the contract. Your employer can fire you. You can quit. There's some rules and stipulations, maybe penalties. You might have a non-compete clause. If you quit, you might have trouble finding another job. Your employer can fire you, but they have to have a reason to do so. You're paid a monetary wage, possibly benefits as well. You've got a right to organize and bargain collectively. So my question then is, where does modern wage labor fall on this chart? With a hand. Thank you. Semi. Why are you saying, you're saying semi-free, like here in the middle? Or, okay, why are you saying semi-free? You can quit though. If you don't like how much money you're being paid, you can form a union, bargain collectively. But you're right. You are subject to your boss. They're giving you orders. Yeah, sir.
It's not totally free, but it would be closer to free than semi. I think it's 3/4 away or something. Because it's still a contract.
All right, so you're saying it should be about 3/4 of the way between semi-free and free. You're not putting it quite all the way to free because there's a contract there. You're governed by these rules. 3/4, 7/8, something like that. Closer to free, but not all the way to the end. We got one more. We got a hand. If we can get a microphone to him. The freedom to do something within margins. Yeah, within some limits. All right, these are great comments, guys. I would class modern wage slavery as free, but as people have pointed out, there's some gray area there. And that's going to be true for every form of labor you look at from any place and any time in history. Essentially, in modern wage labor, you are free. But there are limits. There's a contract. There's limits. You may face practical considerations, like in theory you're free to quit or form a union, but in practice you don't have the time or energy. You can't find anything else. But generally I'm going to say it's free, but there's some gray there. There's some gray there. There are some restrictions on a person's freedom in wage labor. And we'll see the reverse in some other things. Let's keep going. Let's keep going. Here's an example from a little further back, apprenticeships. So apprenticeships were very common in late medieval, early modern Europe. They were a common institution. If you were, say, a peasant, you're someone whose family has few opportunities, you're going to try and find a skilled craftsman, someone who makes much more money, who has much higher status in the community than you, and you will contract your child to this person. Often, you will pay this craftsman, this tailor, or this blacksmith for the privilege of you giving them your child. And then your child will live with them for a period of years, usually around 7 years. The master will provide them with food, with shelter, and with job training. Sometimes the parents would come visit them. Sometimes the parents just won't see their children again for 7 years. Children in apprenticeships could not leave. They were not free to leave. If they disobeyed the master or screwed something up, the master was free to punish them corporally using violence. They were not paid any kind of monetary wage for the work that they were doing. And while rules existed, often protecting the apprentice, there's no shortage of court cases, especially from early modern Europe, of, say, parents suing to get children released from apprenticeships who aren't being released, or to make sure that their children's rights are being respected and they're actually being trained in the job and not just used as servants or things like that. So is apprenticeship, where does that fall on our graph? Where should we put that? Can we, I see a hand right over here, if we can get a microphone to them, and let me know if we've got any comments. Hold on, it's not on.
You need to press the button.
Don't have a lot of experience with microphones.
So good.
I would say this is semi-free.
Mhm.
It's free for the parents,
Mhm.
but the child doesn't have freedom. So it's semi-free. And of
Mhm.
course, a lot would depend on, who the master is, how they treat the child, and if they keep their end of the bargain. But maybe at the end of it, the child was happy that they had this skill, so it's semi-free. It's not totally slavery and it's not totally free.
I like that semi-free answer. Ideally, after 7 years, the child comes out with a valuable skill, can advance in society and have a source of income their parents never did. And this was often seen as a privilege and an opportunity. And so in that sense, there's a free aspect to it, but you're right. The kid doesn't get a choice in this. And especially during those 7 years,
Well, yeah. And
Yeah.
you have to remember, though, that children in general don't have a lot of freedom until they reach adulthood.
and this is also true. How different is this from parents just sending their kids to school and saying you're going to go to school whether you want to or not?
Right, right.
I mean, there's no corporal punishment anymore, but
There used to be.
there used to be. There used to be. I like that point. Anyone else? Anyone else got a comment? Do we have one online? No? No? All right. Well, I like that answer. I like that answer that Devorah gave us. I think apprenticeships fall somewhere around semi-free, especially depending on the circumstances of the apprenticeship and the precise kind of rules we're following here. Here's another one. Early industrial labor. Workers of any age agree to work for an employer. This is free in the sense that you are agreeing to go to work. You are paid a wage. That wage may be monetary. You may be paid company scrip that you can only use to buy things from a company store. You may also be paid a wage with deductions. Often early industrial workers got housing and food from the company, and the company would deduct money from their wage to pay for this food and housing. There was no guaranteed right to quit. We have records as late as the 1930s of industrial workers trying to leave their jobs and being told you sold a contract, and a judge telling them you have to go back to your factory. They may be fired at any time, often for any reason. They don't have a right to collectively bargain. This was common in 19th and 20th century Europe, America, and Japan. But you are entering into this work freely. You are being paid a wage set by market prices. If no one will take the job, the employer has to raise the wage. Where do we put this? Yes, we got a hand right here if we can get, thank you.
Oh, this, I would put it, it's not semi-free, it's not quite unfree, again, something in the middle.
Mhm.
And there's several reasons. I'm thinking of the song, load 16 tons and what do I get? Another day older and deeper in debt. And so in a way, they were, because of these contracts,
Mhm.
they ended up owing money and they couldn't leave the jobs, and for many reasons. And as we know, the setting of the wages was often colluded.
Mhm.
Therefore, they weren't really even free to negotiate wages in practice.
So no, these are all real things. What was there's another verse in the song, Saint Peter, don't take me home. I owe my soul to the company store. That's so where do we put this though? Where do we put this though? You said it's not, you didn't want to call it semi-free, but you didn't want to call it free. 1/4 between unfree and semi-free. All right, between unfree and semi-free. We've got another hand over here. I'd like to hear this.
Oh, I have a question. What did
Please.
he mean by colluded?
So in theory, during the Industrial Revolution, in theory, wages were set by the free market. If no one wants to take a job, then the employer, the factory, has to offer higher pay. But in practice, what would sometimes happen is the owners of the factories would get together and say, we're all going to set the wage at this. So you don't have to worry about your best workers trying to go to the factory that's offering more money, or you don't have to worry about your workers saying, oh, hey, at Johnson's factory, they're paying, they're paying 20% more than what we're making here. We want that. And then I believe that's what you meant by collusion. Yeah, Dwight.
I have a question.
Please.
You gave an example to show that you weren't free to quit. And I wonder if that was more the exception rather than a rule. Somehow I picture that in many cases, you just didn't show up for work.
Sure.
And that was the end of it.
That's true. That's absolutely true. It really varied where you were and when you were. The case I cited from the 1930s was very much an outlier. By the 30s, workers in almost every context had a right to quit their jobs. And those who couldn't, it was relatively rare. The worker in question owed a significant debt to the company. And so this, and he was picked up for vagrancy. It became apparent he owed this money to his company and had quit his job in an effort to avoid having to pay this debt. And so a judge said, you need to go back to work and pay off your debt before you can quit under the terms of the contract you agreed to sign. So it was far from universal. But it existed. It existed, especially if we go all the way back into the really early Industrial Revolution, into like the 1780s, 1790s, early 1800s. Then you do start to see the law saying, well, you signed a contract to agree to work for this employer for a fixed amount of time. That time's not up. I wouldn't say it was true for everyone or even necessarily most people. And of course, you just leave. Right? It's kind of hard to find you, but it's also not hard to find examples of workers being told, no, you can't leave. In England, it wasn't until the mid-1800s that a judge ruled, it was ruled conclusively that yes, workers have a right to quit their job and you cannot force them to keep working at that job. Yes, Simone.
I have a question. It's about the children who worked in the mines. And I would say that they were double unfree because their parents expected them to earn their keep and their boss expected them to earn their keep.
Trying to go back.
And they really had no freedom.
There's always the question of children. Often, no, go back. I have control now. Oh, good. It does. Oh, there we are. Yeah. We got kids right here working in a factory. You got kids working in mines. Often those kids were put to work by their parents. Putting a kid to work means a source of wages for the parents, and often the wages were handed directly to the parents and not to the children. So they frequently didn't have much in the way of freedom in terms of that. There's also some cases, if you go all the way back to like I said, 1790s, 1810s, there's cases of orphans, children who don't have parents, and the orphanage would contract the children out for labor to create a stream of money for the orphanage. So I would say, especially for those children who don't really have a choice for that, I'd put that certainly in this quarter. Also, the worse effects of the company store system, where workers would be paid in company script they couldn't spend elsewhere, and debt might be used to chain workers to a company so they couldn't quit. I would put that here between unfree and semi-free, because after all, they're not being bought and sold. They are agreeing to enter these contracts, at least in theory, of their own free will. And then I'd put other types, especially more skilled industrial labor, more in the semi-free or in this third quadrant, because especially if your work was valuable, or if it was a time when labor was in high demand, then the rights of workers could expand quite a bit. So I think it's a sort of murky-ish thing in the middle here. That's my opinion, and you're welcome to disagree with it. How about indentured servitude? You guys may have heard of this one. People of any age, because this could be children, this could be adults, would agree to work for a period typically 3 to 7 years. Often we see this very much in British North America or English North America during the colonization, when you've got like Virginia and Massachusetts and places like that. Often people wanted to go to the colonies where there were opportunities they didn't have back in England. They couldn't afford the price of a ticket. There were people in those colonies who needed workers, and so they would agree, I will promise to work for you. I'll indenture myself for the next 3 to 7 years to pay for the price of my ticket. You'll pay to bring me over. Once I'm here, you'll provide me with clothing and shelter. I'll work for you for free for that time. And when it's over, you'll give me my freedom dues. They were required to pay them something. Usually the freedom dues weren't money. Sometimes they were tools. Sometimes they were clothing. Sometimes they were a certain amount of food. And even sometimes these indentured servants got land at the end, because there was much more availability of land in the English colonies than there was back in England. At the same time, some indentured servants were criminals. Sometimes criminals were told, we can send you to jail, or you can agree to transportation. You'll be indentured to an employer in Virginia or wherever. So they didn't necessarily have a choice there. And you also had masters telling indentured servants, well, you got sick and I had to pay for your medicine, so I'm going to add an extra 6 months to your term. Or you're a woman, you got pregnant, and so you couldn't work as much during those 9 months of your pregnancy. So I'm adding 9 months to that time. And I also had to help take care of the kid and provide that kid with food and shelter. So I'm going to add another year or so. And so these could be extended quite a bit. During your period of indenture, you were subject to corporal punishment if you disobeyed your master. You were not free to leave. If you tried to leave, you could be hunted down and taken back. You were not free to marry. They did not like it when indentured servants had children. And that was not popular. So where does indentured servitude fall? Where do we put this? Where do we put this practice? Yeah, we got a hand. Can we get the, hold on a sec. Can we get the microphone to you? So the people online can hear you?
More to unfree because you had a choice, not completely unfree because you had a choice to be indentured.
I like that. Yeah, somewhere in here, more towards unfree. Yeah, I would argue unfree. I would argue, well, let me hear other people's comments. Let me hear other people's comments, because I like your answer. I like your answer. Is there anyone who disagrees, says it's a bit more free, says it's a bit less free? We got a hand.
Situation.
Sure.
Because if you were a prisoner who were, serving for your time, you were not free. If you signed up, you were free to choose at the time you signed up, but once you were into the project or whatever, you were no longer free until you got out of it.
Thank you. Yes, I think you're both correct. I think broadly indentured servitude is a type of unfree labor. I think it's more free than many other types of unfree labor, because a lot of people do enter into this voluntarily, and especially if you are one of those people who you want a chance for land and social mobility in Pennsylvania that you're not going to get back in England. So you can see why someone would enter, sell themselves essentially into temporary slavery. So it's more free than some other types of unfree labor, but I do think this is a type of unfree labor eventually. Yeah, Dwight?
I would also sort of include into any of these categorizations a consideration of how free you were in your free time, because that's a component of both slavery and freedom. That okay, you in any of those things, maybe you had to work 10 hours on a machine, but then you got to go home and do what you want. And same with these indentured servants.
Yes. No, that's a very good point. And we've got a number of indentured servant contracts have survived. So we know what these terms were. And some of them specify getting like Sundays off, for instance. Yeah, I think you're early industrial worker, even the one who is chained with debt and can't really go somewhere, or the child who is sent to work and doesn't actually get the money. They go home and they're pretty free. The indentured servant lives in their master's household. And so they're often subject to direction from their master, even in what we might think of as off hours. You're not working in a field anymore, but we need you to go wash some dishes or clean the house. But of course, it is going to depend on the master. And like I said, a lot of indentured contracts, especially, coming from England, where religion is a major part of people's lives, the idea that you need to have some free time to be able to at least go to church and on Sundays have a day of rest is often built in. Sure, I'll take one more and then I want to move on.
Just a question. How many hours of work per week are we talking here?
Good question. I mean, it's going to, I don't want to say all of them, because obviously you're eating and sleeping. But if you are the master of an indentured servant, you're paying a fixed amount to provide them with shelter and clothing and food. That amount isn't going to go up or down really depending on how much you work them. So your financial incentive is to get the maximum amount of work out of this person that you possibly can before their contract ends in 3 to 7 years. And so you're going to be trying to get them to work as much as possible. Obviously, there's a limit to this. You work someone too hard, there you have, they're going to have health issues. They may collapse. They may get injured. Oh gosh, a 60-hour work week would not be uncommon. That would be, I think, towards the lower end of the number of hours you would expect. Because if they're not working in the field, you want them doing some kind of work in your house. Because any free time an indentured servant has is value that you as the master of an indentured servant are not getting from that servant. So it is going to be quite high in terms of the work. And as with apprenticeships, we have a host of court cases. There's a lot of legal records of people suing because, especially parents whose children had ended up indentured, parents suing and saying, the master of my child who holds their indenture is not releasing them when their time is up, or is extending their indenture unfairly, or has released them but has not given them their freedom dues. And so the ability of these contracts to be enforced, and there was always a certain amount of people ignoring the rules. All right, I know I said no more, but all right, I'll take one more. That's okay.
Then technically, freedom would mean that you don't have to get any kind of permission from anything. So in this society, if we want to get a job, we had to ask somebody. So technically, it's kind of a form of slavery because we don't have absolute freedom.
So I hear what you're saying. I agree, we don't have absolute freedom. I don't think anyone anywhere has ever really had absolute freedom unless you're alone on a deserted island or something. I wouldn't call it slavery, but we did make a point earlier, because the very first type of labor we talked about was wage labor, modern wage labor. And we talked about how there are limits on modern wage labor. You are subject to the directions of your boss. You may be, there may be penalties you pay if you quit your job. You may be taking that job not because you want it, but because you have to feed yourself and to pay your rent. And is that truly a condition of freedom? And by historical standards, by the standards of world history, that's as free as it really gets. It doesn't really get a whole lot freer than that, but you're right, there's that gray area. There's always going to be there's always some kind of restrictions there. And who knows, maybe 100 or 200 or 300 years from now, people will look back and say, wow, we have so much more freedom to choose our employment than those poor sods back in the 21st century. But we can't know that, until we get there. All right, this is getting us a little off topic, so let's keep going. I wanted to talk about Greco-Roman slavery. So Greco-Roman slavery is an interesting one. Typically prisoners of war, especially when we get to the Romans. A lot of Roman slaves are prisoners of war. Also criminals, if you were convicted of a crime for which the penalty was you paid some kind of fine and you couldn't afford to pay the fine, they would usually make you a slave. If you were born to a slave mother, and of course, slaves just bought from other people. They were considered property. You could, Greco-Roman slavery, you could be sold, you could be rented, you could be physically punished without consequence. Slaves were left and inherited. When we have surviving records from Roman businesses that'll have lists of employees and they'll have lists of tools the business has, and the slaves will appear on the list of tools for purposes of taxation and inheritance and other things. They could be physically punished without consequence, even in cases that severely injured or sometimes even killed the slave. Greco-Roman slaves could also own property. They could marry. We have records of them making contracts sometimes on behalf of their owners. An owner could be like, all right, slave, I need you to go to Athens from Rome. I need you to negotiate a deal with this merchant who lives in Athens and then come back with the contract for me. I'm making you my financial agent. Public slaves who were owned not by individuals, but by the Roman state or by the government of one of the Greek city-states, could be appointed to positions of power over free people. There's a lot of solid records of powerful government officials being in fact slaves who were owned by, say, the emperor or by collectively by the Greek city. Let's see, once freed, slaves were considered second-class citizens. They couldn't vote or become citizens in Greek states. They couldn't hold public offices in Rome. We have records of Romans tattooing the foreheads of slaves who had tried to escape or requiring them to wear tags around their necks. The tag was actually something that Emperor Constantine put in place. He said, stop tattooing the foreheads of slaves. This is overly cruel, but you can make them wear a collar instead that they can never take off so that everyone who sees them will know they are a slave who has tried to escape. This right here, these two gentlemen were freedmen. They were former slaves who acquired enough property. They were able to buy their freedom. They held skilled jobs. We've got the tools they used in those jobs appearing around them. They were able to buy their freedom and were successful enough to jointly pay for this funeral monument. So I will take questions, and also, of course, the question I have for you is, where do we put Greco-Roman slavery on this chart? Who's got a question or an answer to my question? Hands, guys? Well, yeah, if we can get the.
Last two kind of reminded me of. Those last two actually kind of remind me of well, we haven't gotten there yet, but like Islamic slavery, like with the Mamluks and the Umayyads.
We will, yes. There's definitely similarities there. And when we talk about pre-modern slavery generally, it often takes some similar patterns. And you're onto something. Good on you to bring that up. I saw a couple of people start to raise their hands earlier. Does someone? Yeah, yeah.
I was thinking about where the benefits are of any of this if
Mhm.
you're a slave,
Yeah.
which means you have to probably be very positive all the time. Meanwhile, it seems like some of those benefits in terms of what a slave learns and then takes to their freedom, some of them are starting to show now in history. Do they continue to evolve?
If you mean benefits like apprenticeship, like you learn a skill, usually that wasn't the case in this sort of slavery. Generally, you didn't become a slave to learn a skill. What happened was you were enslaved. If you had a valuable skill, you were a much more expensive slave. You were much more trusted. You had greater rights and freedoms, or at least greater freedoms, maybe not necessarily greater rights, but greater freedoms, and a pretty good chance, if you worked for your master and made them enough money, of eventually buying your own freedom. If you didn't have those skills, you might be trained in a skill because the slave owner, the person who's got you wants to sell you for more money, but most likely you'd end up doing some kind of menial work with much less freedom and much less opportunities to earn money to buy your freedom. The worst, considered by all the Roman sources and the Greek sources, the worst job you could be given was the mines. No one, free people did not want to work in mines. These early mines were incredibly dangerous. People died all the time. And so the mines were where you sent condemned criminals to be worked to death. And the mines were where you sent the cheapest slaves, the ones who had tried to escape, the ones who had no valuable skills whatsoever. And so I wouldn't talk about benefits necessarily from slavery. One thing I do want to stress here, though, is there's no racial dimension to this. The Roman and Greek slaves included lots of Romans and Greeks. They include British people. They include German tribesmen. They include Hebrews, especially after 70 CE. They include people from North Africa and from East Africa. While the Romans were aware that these are foreigners, there's sort of this idea that many of these people are foreigners. You're required to, if you sold a slave, you had to tell the prospective buyer what national group this slave was from. The idea that slaves were a specific group or a specific color isn't a thing here. Yes, I see we got a hand and we got a hand. Do you want to talk first, Dwight, and then we'll pass it over?
I just wonder if you could tell me how a Greco-Roman slave earned enough money to buy his freedom.
That's a good question, yeah. They have a certain amount of free time. If they finished the work their master gave them and then went and did extra work that made them some money, usually they were allowed to keep that additional money. So it's not going to be easy, because of course your master is trying to make money off of you. So you're working maybe during public holidays, when most Roman businesses are closed, or maybe you're working at night, or maybe while if you're a really trusted slave, your owner is sending you to Athens to contract some kind of deal on his behalf, you can make some kind of trade deal yourself while you're in the process of traveling. Slaves with greater skill, who receive more trust, were the subject of less supervision, and often told, all right, you can go do this, you can go do that, as long as they're generating wealth and money for their master and obeying their owner's instructions. You don't have as many opportunities to make money as a freed person, but what happens is Greek and Roman slave owners understand that if you want to motivate someone to be loyal to you and to not try to escape, and to not sabotage the work they're doing, then letting them have some more freedom to earn money, giving them some more spare time to earn some extra property on their own is a good way to do that. Does this make sense? Because like we think, when are they going to have the time to do this? Well, if you've got a slave who's a skilled worker, they're doing something that's really difficult, right? Or something that requires a good skill, that's something that if they're unmotivated, they can sabotage really easily, right? And if you don't want them doing that, you want to give them some extra time. So there's kind of an understanding, I'm going to give you some more freedom to earn money so you can eventually be free. And you're going to do the best, you're actually going to do good work on the work that I tell you to do. This would not be true for like people without those valuable skills. And then we had a hand over here and then one over here. Yeah, and then I think we'll move on after.
I just wanted
Sure.
the aspect of this, of how we think of slavery.
Mhm.
Is it also about how we think and what we see and understand?
Mhm.
And so we can be in slavery within ourselves, and our circumstances can own us. So is that maybe that's about the prevailing those circumstances, to be free from those things within ourselves?
There's very much a cultural and one might even say psychological dimension to slavery. How we define slaves, how we see them. The people in the ancient world treated slavery as a fact of life. They saw it as a normal, common thing. And other than the odd philosopher, no one really proposes getting rid of it for the same reason no one proposes, I don't know, changing some other basic fundamental aspect of their society that is seen as somewhat cruel but necessary. Something like, I don't know, punishing criminals. And of course, you have the idea of who is a slave and who isn't a slave. Most Americans, when they think slavery, think Southern chattel slavery, think what plantation slavery looked like in the American South, because that's what we teach in our schools. And of course we do, because that's what slavery looked like in this country. So that's what we learn about. And we're going to talk about that more a little later in this lesson. But that's not what slavery looked like in most places and at most times. In the West, slavery's long been connected to like nationality or ethnicity or a certain group. Do you guys know, anyone know where the word slave comes from originally? Yeah? Slav, yes. Because for a long time in Europe, most slaves were Slavic. They were Slavic people from Eastern Europe, and that's where we get the word slave from. For the Romans, the word for slave in Latin is servus, S-E-R-V-U-S, from which we get the word servant. Because the Romans saw slavery as just another part of, you've got servants and you've got slaves and you've got children and you've got maybe your wife, and they were just part of this general group of dependents, people who were dependent on the male head of the family that you found in every major Roman household, and they just saw it as another variant of that. And that's a very different way of looking at slavery and freedom than the way we look at it here. Devorah, and then let's move on.
I just happened to have seen recently a Nova program on PBS about Pompeii. And I want to expand on what you said before. And they said at that time, there were about 19,000 slaves that were freed every year in the Roman Empire. So it was a real incentive for the slaves to cooperate and dream of being set free.
Yes, absolutely. I want to emphasize, we're not defending this type of slavery. We're not making excuses for it. It was still slavery. People are being forced to work. They're being punished. Some are being killed. They're absolutely being exploited. But like, yes, the Romans and the Greeks were realized, and other ancient people do this too, that especially for your more highly skilled slaves, the ones with really useful abilities, if you want to get the best work out of them, you need to leave that opportunity open for them to earn enough money to buy their freedom, or maybe to marry someone who's free. That was a common way for Greek and Roman slaves to gain their freedom, was in Rome in particular, if you wanted to marry a woman who was a slave, you had to free her first. So otherwise your children wouldn't be legitimate and couldn't inherit your stuff. And so, yeah, no, absolutely. So slaves earning their freedom in that way was quite common. But where do we put that on here? Where do we put that on our chart? This is slavery. Now, no one's given me a suggestion, so I'm just going to tell you what I think. And I think this is unfree. I think Greco-Roman slavery was unfree. It includes some rights and freedoms we don't often think of being associated with slavery. There's a route out of it for some people. For some slaves, they've got more freedom, especially in their personal lives and to make some money. Others have, the ones sent to the mines have none whatsoever. So it may be sort of like here-ish or even here-ish instead of here, but I do think this is an example of unfree labor. We agree? All right, let's keep going. Ooh, I think you clicked and then I think I clicked. All right. This one's politically controversial right now. But prison labor in California. These are criminals. They're convicted under due process of law. They have a right to a defense attorney. They're convicted by juries of their peers for crimes, and they're required to work under state supervision. I'm focusing on California specifically, so no, this isn't private prisons. These are public prisons. They're paid, but they're paid below minimum wage rates. Most prison labor in California, the payment is less than $1 an hour. They can be disciplined for not working, not usually corporal punishment, but things like being put in solitary confinement. They can't quit. They can't leave until their sentence ends. Some have more freedom. The picture right here shows nonviolent offenders towards the end of their sentences who are recruited as firefighters, given the opportunity to work as firefighters and help fight our fires in our state. Is this, where does this fall on our, where does this fall on our chart? We've got a hand over here. Okay.
How do you get into the prison labor service? Does everybody have to do it? Do you have to be special?
I don't know all the details. I don't believe everyone is subject to it, but the ones who are subject to it are not usually given the option to say no. There's some exceptions. There's some who have the freedom to volunteer for this. They can make more money to buy things in the canteen. Those guys who are firefighters are all volunteering to be in the firefighting program. But the bulk of workers in prison industries are not being given a choice. We've got a hand over here.
I guess the question is, let's leave out prison labor for a second. Criminals, convicted criminals give up their freedom. So they're unfree by definition. Are they a little more free if they're allowed to work in labor or not? I mean, they're unfree. I guess the bottom line is they're unfree, but but many want to do it for learning skills, for earning extra credits, whatever, to hopefully even shorten their sentences, I assume, and sometimes model prisoners, et cetera.
Sure.
So then the controversy is that wrong or not? If it's all volunteer, I think it's okay.
You bring up a very good point. This is unfree labor, but these are criminals. Just because it's unfree doesn't mean it's immoral. This may be unfree, and they aren't all volunteers. Many are required to be doing this work, but that doesn't mean it's wrong to do so. I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong. I'm not saying whether this is good or not. I'm just bringing this up as a topic of conversation because we just voted on it, and it's something that is talked about. They are being paid. It has a limited time. Some of them have some freedom, at least, to pick their jobs and do things like decide to be firefighters. Others don't. But just because they don't doesn't mean it's wrong to do this necessarily. We got another hand right there.
At which point in history are slaves or unfree people allowed to begin to learn, whether through books or any kind of process?
I mean, arguably the beginning, right? Generally, it really depends on the slavery we're talking about, right? The idea of prohibiting your slave from learning to read or from learning a more valuable skill, that shows up in plantation slavery, which we're not to yet. But that would not have been common in the ancient world. While your Greek or Roman slave owner or your master of an indentured servant is not necessarily going to want their person, the person that they have control over, to be spending their time learning instead of working. They're probably not going to punish them for doing so or try and prohibit them. Especially for the Greeks and Romans, if your slave learns a more valuable skill, that makes them a more valuable slave. They are now worth more money. that could be useful to you. So I'd say that sort of thing was more common in ancient and pre-modern slavery than what comes later. The idea of that being a threat is a problem. All right, we got more hands. We got more hands over here and then over here, and then I want to move on. Yes.
Which one?
My father, and then yeah.
Thank you for recognizing my question. In this case, I really have a problem with the categorization because it is true that a California convict can be disciplined for declining to work in a variety of different opportunities that they may have. It's considered to be rolled into the punishment of the time that they're sentenced to do. So it isn't really a traditional kind of slavery in that sense at all. Plus, while working in a prison laundry wouldn't necessarily prepare you overly well, there is a lot of different kind of work that people in institutions do. For example, prison industries, California prison industries produces a fair amount of furniture, which is used in California government. And I can tell you from personal experience that stuff is really, really strong. It lasts a very long time. And the point I'm going to make, though, is that it does teach some skills. And certainly that's true both in the prison industry's work. They do computer work. They do some programming even, and they do and of course they do the fire work, which the controversy right now is whether or not you can transition from working in that, as a prisoner on a fire line going over to work for the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. So I don't really know that this fits all that well in this.
You make a good point. You make a good point. Couple of good points. One, I agree. This isn't slavery. What we're describing here is another form of labor. It's not slavery. The question is it free? Is it semi-free? Is it unfree labor? But you're also right in that these categories are arbitrary, and some types of labor don't fit super well in here. This is the challenge of the historian, right? Is that we create these categories. When you try and organize things in history, you come up with terms that you think fit a number of things, but these aren't things that existed originally and historians discovered them. These are ideas historians create to try and better organize and understand history. And often you run into edge cases that don't really quite fit. I will say I don't think this is slavery. Is it unfree? Is it semi-free? Is it unfree, but it's still ethical to do because there's a rehabilitative aspect to it, and these guys are criminals who are being justly punished after being fairly convicted of their crimes? Well, that's a question. That's a question that is difficult to answer, and I'm not going to try and answer that question today. I will say I don't think this is slavery, but whether it's moral or just or things like that, there's a whole debate going on about that right now, and I encourage you guys to take your own positions and understand that stuff how you'd like to. I will take one more question and then I want to move on. Wait, let's get the we want the people online to hear you.
Yeah. So the question is, we didn't talk about the Egyptian slavery of the Hebrews, and I don't know if we're going to go back. We're probably going forward. So my question to you is, we talked about how the indentured servants get their emancipation, how, they earned it and all over time. I'm wondering if there's an academic or secular view of how the Hebrews got their freedom. Obviously, we all know the creation and the biblical and the religious is the,
Sure.
Red Sea parted and so on and so forth. Is there an academic or secular view and we see the pyramids, so we know that the Hebrews existed. They were slaves. They built the pyramids. How they got their emancipation from an academic point of view?
That's a good question. Yeah, just purely from an academic point of view. Part of the issue from the academic point of view is we really have one source, and that source is the Torah. There are mentions of a group of people living. There's mentions of a group of people called the Hapiru, who could be related to the Hebrews in Canaan. So they could be there, and there's mentions in some Egyptian records of like the House of David or mentions of wars with ancient Israel. So we know the Jews existed. We know they were present. There's a number of theories. I don't want to go off, too much, because we're not going to talk about Egyptian slavery specifically at that time, because we don't have a lot of really good sources for it at that time. But we will talk about pre-modern slavery generally. I will say briefly, slave revolt is possible. The mention of the Hebrews taking wealth with them when they leave, that could be interpreted as a type of freedom due. Which we know existed. Freedom dues existed in other forms of slavery and unfree labor other than just indentured servitude. So there could be that there. It could be people, a mass escape of slaves. Some people have suggested the Exodus. Some academics have suggested the Exodus never really happened, and it's sort of a founding myth, and that most of the Hebrews never actually, left Canaan, and maybe there were a handful who were slaves who joined them, and that their different histories kind of got combined. But again, these are theories that are really hard to prove. One interesting one I like is Egypt gets conquered by a group of Semitic people called the Hyksos at one point. And it's entirely possible that these Semitic rulers of Egypt would have brought other Semites down, or maybe elevated a Semitic slave to a high-ranking position because you trust him more than you trust the native Egyptians that your granddad conquered. And that after this Semitic group, the Hyksos, get overthrown, these people who are associated with these foreign conquerors get either enslaved or reduced to a second-class citizenship, or simply expelled from the country, and that might be where this comes from. That makes a certain amount of sense to me, but I want to emphasize this is a theory. It doesn't entirely line up with the timeline, and I don't have hard evidence really to support any of these theories. I'm glad you asked the question. But anyway, let's keep going. So European serfdom, because I did say we were going to talk about serfs here. European serfdom is interesting. Most serfs were born into it. It was very rare for someone to become a serf who their family was not a serf. After serfdom is established in the early Middle Ages, mostly through force, it's a hereditary category. You are subject to feudal obligations with a lord. This means as a serf, you're required to provide part of your harvest to the lord and a fixed amount of unpaid labor each year. When you're not providing that fixed amount of unpaid labor, though, you're on your farm, living your life, making sure you grow enough food to pay your taxes to your lord, but you have certain rights. You have a right to work for yourself on your farm for most of the year to produce enough food to feed yourself. You're not under constant supervision unless you're during that 1, 2, 3 months a year when you're providing free unpaid labor to the Lord. And you have a right to protection from the Lord. Obviously, to what degree this is followed depends on when and where. We have some pretty big serf revolts in the late Middle Ages because serfs felt that their rights weren't being respected by the lords who controlled them. You're not free to leave. You're subject to corporal punishment from the Lord if they don't like something you've done. And you cannot marry without the Lord's permission. And though, as far as we can tell, marrying was usually, you asked like one of the Lord's chief servants, he's like, yeah, sure, go ahead. The Lord usually didn't care about that. But you're not free to leave. You're not free to marry. And this is a status that devolves on your children. Where does this fall on our chart? Unfree, semi-free, or free? I heard a good answer. Can we? I can just repeat it. You said semi-free. Is there anyone who gives me an answer other than semi-free? Yeah. You think it's much closer to unfree? Where are we putting it? A quarter? Close down here, down here. 20%. I like that, 20%. I'm getting a question, who owns the land? The Lord owns the land. Legally, the Lord owns the land. The labor and farm produce, usually grain, that the serfs are providing is a sort of rent to pay the Lord for the right to farm on that land. to grow enough food to feed yourself, and also for the Lord's military protection if you get in danger. That was how it was envisioned. But yes, no, the Lord is the owner of the land, or the king is the owner of the land, and he's giving the land to the Lord. But either way, the serfs don't own. These are good answers. Most historians say serfdom is unfree. They say it's unfree, but it's more free than slavery, because you can't really sell your serfs. The serfs aren't owned as property. The land is owned as property, and the serfs are required to stay on the land and can't leave. So if you're a lord, you can sell your land and the serfs with it, but you can't like sell serfs to someone else. I see a hand asking a question. So I would say unfree, but like, yeah, maybe 20, 25% here. Yeah.
Has it ever happened that serfs who had a very good crop could sell the excess crop and make some money, do a side hustle, basically?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Serfs could own property. They generally didn't own land, but they could sell some of their crop and make some money. They could have their child be apprenticed and the kid becomes a shoemaker. They're still tied to the land and can't leave, but now they've got a more respectable, more profitable job. There generally weren't a lot of good ways for serfs to buy their freedom because they're not property. And lords aren't interested in selling land to the serfs. But yes, serfs could make money on the side, have their own businesses, make their own money from from selling part of their crop, and did. That was common, and we've got good records attesting to these things. Which is why, while I do put it in unfree because they can't leave, you're stuck in this for generations. It's unfree, but trending in the semi-free direction. All right. Next. There we are. Soviet penal labor. This is one that my great-grandfather was involved in, and I'm sure I'm not the only person in this room who had ancestors involved in Soviet penal labor. People convicted both of ordinary crimes and also arrested for political reasons, for disagreeing with the government. My great-grandfather was arrested, according to my grandmother, because he refused to give up his Polish passport and accept a Soviet one. Were required to work on state projects. This was the infamous system of gulags. And this could be a camp where, temporary camp, you're working on a railroad or building a road or building buildings, or this could be resource extraction, you're in a mine, or my great-grandfather was logging at a logging camp. Corporal punishment, if you disagree, executions for major acts of resistance. Somewhere around 10% of the inmates in the gulag were released in any given year, usually because they were so physically run down that they could no longer work. If you were so physically, if you were sick, maybe you got a terminal disease, or you or injured yourself, you lost a leg, or you just couldn't work, often then they would release you. But that was for most of these guys really the only way out. You could not leave. You could not choose your work assignments. I saw a hand. If we could get a microphone to you.
I was just wondering if if that went back to like the Tsarist era, or just like all invented in the Soviet era.
Good question. So there was some degree. In a sec. I just want to answer this, and then I'll get to you. There was some of this in the Tsarist era, especially of criminals. It was massively expanded in the Soviet era. While this sort of like forced labor for political opponents and common criminals was not rare in the 19th and 20th century, it is much, much bigger in the Soviet Union than it was during the Tsarist era, if simply because the Soviet Union had a much more state capacity. They were much more capable of organizing things and doing things for their government than the Tsarist government could. Yes, I see a hand.
Yeah, so you talked about your grandfather in the Soviet era. My grandfather was born in 1907. In Soviet Union area in Russia. And he was put on a boat with his brother to England so that he could escape World War I. In other words, he could escape the punishment of being in the Tsarist army.
Ooh.
Okay, so that's kind of that whole military thing is a whole different component of this.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely, 100%. I wasn't planning to bring up conscription, but the question of where does conscription fall on this, being told, all right, you're part of the army now, is a very different one. As generally, historians, anthropologists, academics who look at this do not consider military conscription to be an example of slavery. It's of limited duration, and there's this idea that in a war, a government has a certain right to conscript able-bodied citizens into its army to fight. Whether that's ethical or moral or not is another question. And of course, you have the treatment of Jews in the Russian army specifically adds a whole nother dimension to what conscription was and what it meant, especially when you had the Tsar doing things like deliberately conscripting Jewish boys at the age of 12 before their bar mitzvah in an effort to commit what some academics would call cultural genocide, to separate these boys from their culture and their history and their communal identity. And of course, it didn't work. You take a kid, you conscript him because he's Jewish, and you discriminate against him for the next 6 years or 7 years for being Jewish. And what you end up with is people with a very strong Jewish identity, but no knowledge of the Jewish religion, which is what they got. Is this unfree labor? I think this gets into something my dad said earlier, which is this two-dimensional graph doesn't really cover all types of labor situations. We would need some kind of a y-axis here if we wanted to find a place to fit this sort of conscription, and conscription as a tool of social control, and where does that go here? But I'm glad you brought it up. All right, I want to keep going because I've got 25 minutes left, and I'm not quite done. I've got one more example for you, and then we're going to talk about pre-modern slavery and Torah slavery. Oh, we have a question in the chat. Yes.
Previous to talk
Okay.
about serfdom, but can serfs join monasteries or nunneries? Gets into that question of money, right? Because you had to be able to pay to become a monk.
Yeah. So yes, so we got a question from the chat, restating it for, I suppose people on Zoom can just read it in the chat. Could serfs join monasteries or nunneries? Could they enter religious service as a means of social mobility? And the answer is usually no. Generally in medieval Europe, if you wanted to do that, you needed to pay for the privilege to do that. They weren't open to just anyone who showed up and volunteered to become a monk. Generally, monks and nuns came from the class of freemen, a class of free peasants who weren't serfs, or and had some more money, or they came from the nobility. And that was really the most common source in the religious classes, was from the nobility, or it really was from the nobility. And even if a serf did have this opportunity, they would have needed permission from their lord to leave their land in order to do this. So generally the answer is no. All right. And where does Soviet penal labor fall? Hang on, just before I go on, I'm going to say unfree. I feel that Soviet penal labor is unfree labor. It's not chattel slavery. You're not buying and selling these people. But I do feel it falls at least towards the unfree end in this system. All right. Last example I'm going to give you, and I don't think it should be too hard for people to figure out where to put this one on the list. This is the one you're most familiar with. Plantation slavery. The plantation slavery complex really starts in the 1600s and just really becomes a huge thing in the 1600s and 1700s. And not to get into too much detail, because this isn't the focus of the talk, but plantation slavery in the American South was actually a small part of a much larger system. And honestly, not even the most brutal part of it. And I want to stress, plantation slavery in the South was inhuman, incredibly brutal. It is considered by historians to be among the most oppressive forms of unfree labor in history. And it was much, much worse when you got into the Caribbean sugar islands, which just sort of devoured human lives. Your life expectancy in places like Jamaica and Barbados in particular was notorious for this. If you were a slave being brought in from Africa, could be a couple of months. It starts in the Mediterranean on Cyprus, actually, spreads to the Atlantic islands, places like Madeira and the Azores, and then ends up in the Caribbean and eventually makes it into places like the American South. About 40% of these slaves brought in end up in Brazil, where many of them are either on sugar plantations or involved in gold mining. Others end up mining silver in Peru. And of course, this slavery has a racial component. Overwhelmingly, the people being brought into plantation slavery are from Africa or people of African descent whose ancestors were brought to the Americas. There's also a sizable minority who were Native American in the early years. It's when they start running out of those that they start bringing in more slaves from Africa. And we got a hand right here.
How did they get to Cyprus first?
How does it start in Cyprus? It starts because, gosh, there was a Crusader kingdom on Cyprus, and they learned sugar was a very valuable commodity. And they learned the details, these Crusaders learned the details of how to grow sugar from the Middle East, where sugar was grown not in plantations, but sort of as a secondary crop for sale. The Mediterranean, long after the fall of the Roman Empire, had a tradition of relatively large slave-run farms. The Romans did this, and even after the Roman Empire falls, you see these large slave-run farms, and so they sort of copy that. And most of the initial slaves are Slavs from Eastern Europe, being brought down to Cyprus to work on these increasingly large sugar farms that are being operated by the King of Cyprus, who owns them personally and is using them as a source of money. And it isn't quite a full plantation then. There are aspects that get adopted, but this is sort of the first version of what will evolve into these modern plantations in the Caribbean. All right. And the next one, I mean, someone want to tell me where they think this falls? It's kind of obvious what I think. Unfree. Plantation slavery, particularly in the Caribbean, is considered as far into unfree as it gets, and it's fairly unusual. Most forms of slavery in history I don't have a racial dimension like this. Most forms of slavery in history, the slaves have our degree of freedom as far as accumulating property, and some could. We have records of slaves in the American South accumulating enough property to buy their freedom. But the degree to which they were under the power of slave owners and the degree to which, I mean, especially those sugar plantations, needed to constantly import more people because the slaves they were using on their plantations were just dying so fast. That is extremely unusual in the history of slavery in world history, and very different. When going back to what I said at the beginning, when a congregant came up to me after that talk I gave a few years ago and said, well, what's in the Torah isn't slavery. I think a lot of that comes from the fact that when he thinks of slavery, he thinks of plantation slavery. And these are very clearly very different systems. There's a hand, I'll take that hand. And then I want to keep going. And there's a question, and then we'll take a question from Zoom. Yes.
Okay, so how were we going to get into Islamic slavery at all, or no? They went around close like Africa.
Not super specifically, but we will speak about it in passing when we get to early modern slavery. Oh gosh. Thank you. The point I make now is we could keep going. There's loads of different types of slaveries and free and semi-free and unfree labor in history that I could be including here. That we could talk about, but we have a limited amount of time. And so I picked a few major ones you guys might have heard of or that might be relevant to you to be the ones to focus on. We will speak a bit more about Islamic slavery like on the next slide, but I've got a question from the chat.
The question from the chat is, were there Jews who owned plantation slaves and followed biblical laws in their treatment of those slaves?
Good question. Good question. So, there were absolutely Jews who owned slaves during the period of Atlantic slavery, this plantation slavery. Relatively few of them were plantation owners, especially in the American South. Jewish slave owners in the American South, the people like Judah P. Benjamin's family, they had slaves usually for housework. You didn't have a lot of plantation owners. Where we do see Jewish-owned plantation slavery, we tend to see it in northern Brazil and in the Dutch colony of what's today the country of Suriname, and back then was the colony of Dutch Guyana. The Netherlands had a lot of freedom for Jews, and so Jews participated in the economic life of the nation, and that included slavery, and that included establishing slave plantations in South America. I will say Jews play a relatively small role in all of this. You might have heard there's an anti-Semitic canard that emerged, especially in the 1980s, that blames Jews for Atlantic slavery, that says like, we did it. And the answer is that's not true. When Atlantic slavery starts, it's Portugal and Spain doing it, two countries that have just outlawed, made it illegal to be Jewish in their countries. Yes, there were Jews who owned slaves during plantation slavery. There were even a few who owned plantations, but we played a relatively small role in this. I'm not saying this as like, oh, look how wonderful and great we are, because Jews were involved, and I'm sure more would have been involved if they could have. In fact, the fact that you see relatively little Jewish involvement in this kind of plantation slavery is as much a product of discrimination against Jews and them being kept out of this incredibly lucrative and super profitable industry as it is than any kind of like we're us being more moral. I just bring this up to push against that anti-Semitic canard that claims that like we did this and somehow orchestrated it. I'll take one more question and then I move on.
My understanding, it was really Spain. It was Christopher Columbus, and he enslaved the indigenous people of the Americas when he came. It was the Dutch West Indies Company, not at all the Jews.
So yes, when Christopher Columbus, the Spanish first show up, initially they use native labor. They use Native American labor. They run out of them though. And that's when they start bringing in increasing numbers of people from Africa, and that's the beginning of Atlantic slavery. And of course, at this point in time,
There's a lot of
indentured.
There's a lot of indentured servitude at that time too. So it's a very slow process that it goes from in the 1500s from being a lot of Native Americans who were used as labor to being a mix of Native Americans and white indentured servants from Europe and some even indentured Africans. And then it slowly over time becomes this very racial boundary lines that it is almost exclusively enslaved people of African descent.
Thank you, Sarah. My wife is an expert in the colonial era in English North America and Revolutionary era, and this is the kind of stuff she writes and talks a lot about, like the evolution of slavery and where it comes from. But you are quite right. This is being done by countries where Judaism is illegal, or is being done by, like, the Dutch East Indies bringing slaves over, or the Danes bringing, even when it's countries where Judaism is legal, we're not playing a huge or outsized role in the slave trade. I don't want to pat ourselves in the back too much. I don't want to, this is extolling things, but like the attempt by Farrakhan and some others to blame us for the Atlantic slave trade has no historical basis. Less than 2% of African slaves who ended up in the United States were either transported on ships owned by Jews, or were owned by at any point in the process. Anyway, let us continue. Let's talk about pre-modern slavery generally. This includes slavery in the Islamic world. This includes slavery in ancient times. We could talk about slavery among Native Americans or in Africa, because pre-modern slavery existed everywhere. It was, as far as we can tell, universal. The earliest written records we have from Sumeria mention slavery existing. As far as we can tell, people, non-state peoples, tribal peoples practice slavery. It seems to have long been the case. And it was thought of as normal. Most of these slaves are prisoners of war. They're criminals, or they are people bought. You're buying them from another group and bringing them in. Pre-modern slavery, especially in ancient times, especially with non-state peoples, which is really kind of what we were. We were still very tribal in the time period we're talking about. Slavery was a way to expand your community. You're trying to make your group bigger by adding more people to it. Now you're doing this by forcing other people into your group against their will, and you're exploiting those people and not necessarily treating them well. But fundamentally, it's about making your group bigger and stronger by adding more people to it. There was always some kind of route to freedom. Most slaves might not get that route, but it always existed to some degree. Usually, these slaves could marry and could accumulate possessions, especially if they had useful or valuable skills. And it was not always lifelong, although it could be sometimes. Yes?
So you'd want the kids to be assimilated into your culture.
Potentially, to some degree. Some people did it more, some people did it less. For instance, if you wanted to talk about Islamic slavery, in the Muslim world, there was a great deal of emphasis on making sure your slaves converted to Islam. And there was this idea that one of the greatest, most righteous acts you could perform was to free a Muslim slave. And so there was this hope that eventually these people you were enslaving would become part of at least the Muslim community. The Iroquois were known for kidnapping people, including some early English colonists, and saying, all right, you're Iroquois now. You're Iroquois, here's your Iroquois name, here's your Iroquois family, here are your parents, here are your siblings. This might include, a certain amount of slavery. You're required to do work. You're not free to leave at all. But the goal was to assimilate you as completely as possible through a kind of forced adoption. At the other end of the spectrum, you have things like the sure.
This is working. And when a lot of those people, those white settlers who had been adopted into the Iroquois, when they might have gotten the opportunity to return, they didn't want to. They wanted to stay with the Iroquois. It's a very, very interesting phenomenon. It happened all the time in the colonial world.
It was very mysterious to a lot of the English settlers why their members, these Christian people these Christian Englishmen, or English women who have been kidnapped by the Iroquois aren't desperate to escape these heathens, but would like to stay with them. And there's a number of examples of it happening. You can blame Stockholm Syndrome. You can say Iroquois society sometimes offered them opportunities for things like social advancement.
And for a lot of the women, it offered more freedom and choice in their lives.
Offers more freedom. But they seem to have been fairly successful at that. On the other end of the spectrum, you have groups like the Haida in the Pacific Northwest, who took large numbers of slaves as prisoners of war. And slavery among the Haida was not passed on to children. Children were explicitly not slaves, but there was a subgroup in Haida society who were called born of slaves. And so if you had any slave ancestry, even if it was your great-great-great-great-grandparent, you were considered born of slaves and were considered lesser and sort of a second-class citizen. So in some cases, the goal is make them a full part of your society. In some cases, it's, well, we want them part of our society, but we want them to know their place. So it depends. In Mesopotamia, and this is a carving showing slaves being led to market to be sold from ancient Mesopotamia, we've got some good records from things like Hammurabi's Code, rules and regulations about slaves. From this, we know that slaves often bought their freedom. We know they often became free by marrying male slaves marrying freed women, or especially daughters of their owners. This was a common route to freedom for them. We know they were required to wear certain types of clothing, especially special hats, so people who saw them knew they were slaves. We know they could, in certain circumstances, represent their owners, their slave masters, slave owners, for the purpose of negotiating contracts. We know that most Mesopotamian slaves were not the result of criminals becoming slaves. They seem to have very few laws that made you slaves, but were either the result of prisoners of war or of being purchased from other countries. But there's a phenomenon I also want to address that's kind of complicated here and often isn't. But why would you sell yourself or your child into slavery? Because this happened in pre-modern slavery all the time. I hear an answer. Can I see? Can we get the yes?
Survival.
Survival. Survival. Anyone have another answer for me? A different one, or maybe an expansion on that one? Did you have a yeah?
So learn a skill, I guess.
Learn a skill like apprenticeship, yeah.
Debt.
Debt. Yeah, debt. You owe money, yeah.
Social mobility.
Social mobility. These are all great answers. Let's go back. There we are. Voluntary. I'm putting that in quotes. Okay, one more question, and then I'll keep going with this.
Yeah.
That's fair. Yes.
Can you elaborate on how being a slave makes you more social?
I think Nathan's about to. I just knew he wanted that answer.
It depends on what we're speaking specifically about, and that's in quotation marks, voluntary slavery, because there's circumstances where often weren't entirely voluntary. At its most basic, it's a question of survival. If you cannot feed yourself, or you cannot feed your children, or all of your children, selling yourself or one of your children into slavery was a way of guaranteeing, at least at the bare minimum, that they get fed and sheltered and that they are going to survive. If you owe debts, sometimes you were sold against your will, or you could make the choice to sell yourself. We have paupers, poor people, would sometimes sell themselves into slavery to generate money, maybe to generate money for the rest of their family, or as Sarah pointed out, for social advancement. If you were a voluntary slave, if you sold yourself into slavery to avoid starvation or because you were poor, you were the most valued and trusted type of slave. The slave owner isn't going to worry about you running away or stealing something or trying to sabotage the work he wants you to do or she wants you to do, because we do have some records of female slave owners, because you're there willing. And so often these sorts of voluntary slaves will be put in managerial positions to oversee other slaves. They might even be put in positions of authority over free people. That kind of thing happened a fair amount. You brought up slavery in the Islamic world. One thing we see quite a bit in the Islamic world is we see slave ministers. In the Ottoman Empire, some of the most powerful people, the grand viziers, the equivalent of cabinet members for the Ottoman sultans, were slaves that the sultan owned. Because such people were not a threat, right? They're not a threat to the king or the sultan's power. If they accumulate too much money or they seem too powerful, they're his slave. He can have them killed. He can just take their stuff away from them. They're not dangerous the way a free person, especially another royal or a member of the nobility, would be in that position. We know that Morocco and Egypt both built armies of slaves. In Morocco, this particular army that the Sultan of Morocco puts together becomes a major factor. They remain slaves specifically owned by the Sultan. They become a major player in Moroccan politics. In Egypt, those slave soldiers eventually overthrow the Egyptian government and establish the Mamluk dynasty. But there's this idea that these people, if you give them opportunities, you can put them in positions of power and they may be easier to control and someone you're more likely to trust. Yes.
Oh, I was just going to mention Turkey as well. I forgot the name of the armies, the Turkish armies.
Janissaries. Yes, the Janissaries, absolutely. The Janissaries were originally mostly Christian boys from the Caucasus Mountains who are acquired as slaves, who are converted to Islam, and they are slaves directly of the Sultan. And eventually the Sultan loses control of them. But for quite a while, the idea is that this gives the monarch much more power over his servants.
They're made eunuchs, right?
Some places they are, some places they aren't. Some places they aren't. Depends. I don't believe depends on the era. Depends on the era. All right. What was I? Yes. That covers this complicated question of, quote, voluntary slavery, because a lot of these people are desperate. But, you know, if you're starving, this is an option. If you're extremely poor, you're at the very bottom of society. This is a way to be, at minimum, turned into some kind of a steward, put in charge of other slaves. And so that's an option people go for. And of course, there's the question of selling your daughter. Selling her into marriage with someone who's got wealth, who can provide her with a better standard of living, a higher position in society. To us, that seems unthinkable. Back then, when marriage was much more of a financial transaction, then it was something people were much more willing to do. I want to keep going because we're almost out of time, and I want to emphasize some important stuff before we run out and we're spilling over. So let's see, next one. Thank you. Slavery in the Torah. So we've talked about slavery in Mesopotamia and the world history, in pre-modern slavery generally. There's two types of slaves mentioned in the Torah: Hebrews and foreigners. If you're a Hebrew slave, you can only become a slave by voluntarily, because you're in debt. Or because you're a pauper selling yourself into slavery. By being convicted of theft, if you can't afford to pay back the penalty you owe the person you stole from, you could be sold into slavery. Or if you were Jewish, if you were a Hebrew and you were owned by someone who wasn't Jewish, we have an obligation, we're told in the Torah, to buy that person, and now they're your slave, but you don't want them being a slave to a non-Jew. A father could sell his daughter into slavery for the purpose of her becoming, doing either housework or becoming a husband, becoming a wife to the owner, the master who's bought her, or potentially his son. Hebrew slaves were freed after 6 years, but could choose to remain for life. They were subject to corporal punishment if they misbehaved, or refused to follow orders, and they were not free to marry. We know that a slave owner could give a Hebrew slave a non-Jewish spouse to marry and say, all right, you're marrying this person now. According to the Talmud, and of course the Talmud is coming much, much later than the rules we have in the Torah, the Talmud says Hebrew slavery ends when we stop observing the Jubilee year. When we no longer know when that 7th year is when Hebrew slaves go free. So if we're not going to free them, then we're not allowed to have them as slaves. We know, goodness, that's Hebrew slaves, but then we've got another category. We've got foreign slaves. Many of these are prisoners of war. Others are purchased from surrounding nations. They were considered part of their master's household. If you've got a non-Jewish slave, they're man, they must be circumcised. They must practice the Jewish holidays, including Shabbat, which means they get the benefits of these holidays. They get the time off, but they're also required to perform some of the mitzvot associated with these holidays. They were required to partake of the Passover sacrifice, for instance. They could accumulate property. They could buy their freedom. It seems that marrying one of the daughters of the slave owner was a not uncommon way for non-Jewish slaves, once they've converted to Judaism, to gain their freedom. It lasted for life. It could be passed on to children. You had some basic protections. If a Hebrew slave was injured, it was treated as if you had injured a free person. If a foreign slave was injured severely enough, and the Torah says if their tooth is knocked out or they lose an eye, they are freed automatically, but the master is not punished as if it had been a free person. But if they're killed, then it's treated as if you'd killed a free person. And the Talmud says once they're recognized as Jewish, if they've read from the Torah or they've wrapped tefillin publicly, then they go free. And they may not be sold to non-Jews. Even if they're not Jewish, you cannot sell a non-Jewish slave to someone who's not Jewish because they're required to perform some mitzvot. And so they'll be in a position where they can no longer perform those mitzvot. What do you guys think about this? I'll take thoughts, questions, and also where should this fall on our chart? Yeah.
Well, I was struck yesterday while we were.
Oh, hold on one second. We've got a microphone.
I was struck yesterday while we were reading Mishpatim that the rules that the guarantees in the Sefer Torah pertained only to Jewish slaves, and it seemed like it was silent as to non-Jewish slaves. And in the context of the 21st century, I find that very disturbing. I assume that there is Talmudic background that describes some of the rights that had to be offered to the non-Jewish slaves. It sounds like from what you've said, but it's still that difference is very hard to reconcile with today's, with any kind of concept. And so I'm thinking also that there's a sense, a rabbinic sense that there's been a progress within the Jewish world from slavery to non-slavery, that this was a long time thing that had to be tolerated over generations in order to reach a point in which slavery would not be countenanced, that would not be tolerated. And yet I wonder if that same feeling existed for the non-Jewish slaves, because I can say it's very hard to reconcile that.
Yeah, this doesn't, reconciling this with modern ethics is not something I'm going to try and do today. I'm putting this sort of slavery in the context of world history, and I think it reconciles much better with what pre-modern slavery looked like, which was where it was universal and people thought it was normal. You make a good point. Jewish and non-Jewish slaves are treated very, very differently. The Jewish ones, you can't be a slave really for more than 6 years unless they make that choice to remain with their master. And when we don't know how closely the rules were always followed, Jeremiah mentions people not letting Jewish slaves go free in that 7th year. I think that sounds much more like something that's semi-free as far as it comes to Jewish slaves, and a form of unfree labor when we get into how the foreign slaves are treated. I will say, well, it's not Mishpatim. The Torah does say if you put out the eye of a non-Jewish slave or you knock out their tooth, they are automatically freed. And then if you kill them, it is as if you had killed a free man. The Talmud, writing much later in a different context, expands on that and says if you give any permanent injury to a non-Jewish slave at all, then they are freed. But still, that's a very different situation than how Hebrew slaves were treated. This is true. Anyone else? We got a hand.
I don't need this. I'm one of the guys that started this whole life. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for inviting people here, because this was our wish to other people. And how important it is, and basically speaking, I'd like to see instead of this crowd 6 times as much people. Because there's so much here that you bring out that is so important. I'd like to see more people. If I'm on the camera somewhere, come and enjoy yourself, because this is what we built it for.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you guys for coming. I would also love to see 6 times as many people here. Just to wrap things up, I want to point out a couple of things. I do think that what the Torah describes is a form of slavery. I think it's a bit more towards semi-free with Jews. It's more towards unfree with non-Jews. I want to note a couple of things. One, especially as far as the non-Jews go, it's very much in line with what pre-modern slavery looked like in Mesopotamia and other places. It's a way of trying to get people and make your group bigger, requiring them to partake in Jewish holidays and be circumcised is very much a way of, you are part of our group now. You're a low status part of our group, maybe even an exploited part of our group, but we're adding you to our group. It's very similar to other forms of pre-modern slavery, except in one respect. There's one way in which the slavery in the Torah is very different, radically even different, from the kind of slavery you see in Mesopotamia. And that is, there's a religious dimension to it. In Mesopotamia, there was no expectation that slaves brought from other countries had any kind of duties to the Mesopotamian gods. The Greeks and Romans did not expect their slaves to abandon what the gods of Britain or Egypt or whatever once they were sold into slavery. It wasn't seen as important. But in Judaism, you aren't allowed to sell a non-Jewish slave to a non-Jewish person. There's this expectation that you will be circumcised, that you will practice some mitzvot, that you will celebrate Jewish holidays, which are things that are expectations that did not exist for slaves in other parts of the ancient world. Judaism brings in this idea that each one of us, everyone, including non-Jews, have a personal relationship with God. And this colors all the approaches we take, to the point that by the Talmudic period, you've got the rabbis arguing that becoming Jewish is a way for non-Jews, is one route for non-Jews to escape slavery, which was not the case in other religions. Islam says you can't make Muslim slaves, but if a non-Muslim slave converts, they're still considered a slave. And so that's what makes it different there. And I think that's worth consideration. I am done. I will stay here. I'll take questions for a couple more minutes. I know we've overshot our time. I'm happy to take questions from you guys. So let's get if Dwight, if we can get also you've got this one. So if no one's asking questions on the chat, we've got multiple people. I'll take whoever. Dwight, pick someone. We've got right next to you.
I have a question. I think it's kind of conclusive of all that we've done. Is what does it really mean to be free? And I think perhaps we have to kind of get some understanding of that, get some kind of picture of it to go to it.
Sure.
Otherwise, we're talked about being in captivity or slavery, because the experience that I've seen in life, we were in slavery, but man gave us freedom, but still we weren't free because we still live in parameters that he provides. So we're not free. It's gotten to the point where they can kill us now in our face, and we still have to deal with it.
You make a good point.
So what is truly freedom?
Sure.
And we say, I'll have to say this because I study the Torah, and the Torah is what my reference. But there is things in there about freedom, about being free from all of this.
Yeah, no, we've been talking, I've been talking this presentation, we've spent this whole time trying to define what is slavery, but we haven't tried really to define what is freedom. And that's a different question that really requires a different talk. But one thing I will note is the Torah does emphasize, Dwight, go ahead and take it. There's someone else. The Torah does emphasize that because God redeemed us from slavery in Egypt, the concept is we're his slaves. That he took us from one type of slavery under human beings and made us servants of him. And so are we truly free if we are bound by his laws, or are we truly free if we're bound by the laws of other human beings and the restrictions there? And that's a fascinating question, and one that I would, we could certainly do another talk about in the future. I don't have a simple answer for you right here and right now. Can we, you and then you? If we could get the, oh, there we are. Here, if you could, maybe you can bring that one over.
When you talked about Jews adding religion to slavery, how does that relate to the Catholics with the Native Americans in California, the whole system?
Sure. Well, I mean, Christianity is derived from Judaism. It starts as a branch of Judaism. And so some of the concepts that we originate get adopted in different ways into things like Christianity. In Judaism, you have this idea, slaves are people, they have souls. Their relationship with God and performance of mitzvot matter. There's this attempt to make them part of our group to some degree by incorporating them into the practice of our religion. Later, when we see Christianity and Islam, you start getting the argument that, well, maybe it's okay to enslave people if you are saving their souls, if you're making them part of your group. It's not a direct connection there, but I do think you see a certain aspect of it. One thing you don't see, in those other faces, for instance, in Judaism, we're not allowed to send back escaped slaves. If a slave escapes from another country or from someone who's not Jewish, flees to us, we don't enslave them. They don't become our slave, and we are forbidden explicitly from sending them back or sending them out. And that's not something you see in these other groups. There's sort of this assumption they're here, they join us, maybe they'll convert to their religion, maybe they won't. They're not required to. But we will give them shelter. That is expected. Yes, we've got, yes, right over here. You're very welcome. You're very welcome. I'll take one more question. Where'd the mic go? I'll take one more question here, and then another one from the then whoever's asking stuff in the chat, and then I'll call this done. And of course, you can hang around and ask me questions if you'd like.
Yeah, Nathan. So
yes,
continuum is about labor. That's
yeah.
where you began the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not a question about slavery per se, but something that I know a little about and I care about is baseball. So in the era of
please
prior to free Kurt Floyd, exactly. If you worked for the Dodgers, the owner would tell you at the end of the year how much you were worth. There was, so it seemed to me, and I never thought of it in this terms, this is a very quick question, they were the closer to being serfs than anything else. Because they really had no rights at all to bargain. They couldn't leave, and it was just because of collusion, similar to the could you comment on that?
I think you make a very good point. I think there's definitely a case to be made there that a baseball player is in some way semi-free in that early period when he's tied down by his contract. I do think surely he had some right to just quit and not be a baseball player, though, like to quit and do some other job. And so I don't think you can call him unfree, or even necessarily semi-free, because a serf can't quit and stop being a serf. But it's definitely somewhere in here. It's towards that semi-free direction, because there's some real major restrictions on that wage labor, and he doesn't have a right to totally to set his salary or to keep working in the industry if he doesn't like the terms. So I think you make a very good point.
If you add the fact that these guys, they were all guys, were totally unskilled, couldn't do anything else at all. They came from very poor farm communities. They really had little options.
Yeah, that definitely falls closer towards the semi-free. Yeah, maybe like here or something. Yeah, absolutely. And then Sarah, you've got some questions from the chat.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat that says, in Talmudic times, were daughters free if they can be sold by their fathers and they cannot inherit property, which I think gets into that like sphere of underneath one person, families where you have there's a variety of different people who are underneath the male head of the household, and they're all under that person's control, and how much freedom they have or don't have is very dependent on that person.
Yes. No, absolutely. It's a different type of dependency. In the household, you have slaves, you have daughters, you have servants, you have children, you have wives. All of these were viewed as being just different versions, really, of the same thing by ancient peoples. So the father,
and not just ancient peoples, but also the early modern world, arguably, that complex like relationship between different groups of people within family dynamics and then within the broader household dynamics then becomes the way that the plantation complex of slavery worked.
Because this is true, up into 17th century Virginia, you've got people taking a very similar approach. As for the question of are daughters free, not fully. They weren't seen as they didn't have the same degree of full rights that men did. We're talking about a patriarchal society here. You can argue, I think, persuasively that they're not necessarily slaves, that they're in some other position there. But I do think there's a case to be made that they weren't fully free. Certainly they are dependent. They are dependent on the male head of the household for permission to marry, to leave the household, and in a lot of other contexts.
Like if we're sticking to this continuum, right?
Yeah.
Anybody who isn't the top male head of household is somewhere in the semi-free category.
Yeah, or
between free and semi-free.
At minimum, they're not as free as the male head
Right.
of the household, because he's the citizen. He's the one who is an autonomous political economic unit that the kids aren't. We're getting into like weirdish, like academic language and some fancy concepts here. But I've got another question.
Just want to go back to a favorite subject of myself also is baseball. And there's an example of what the other gentleman was saying. Way back when Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale, presumably the two best players in baseball, went on strike and refused to play for the Dodgers because they wanted, I think, more than 125,000 for Koufax and 100,000 for Drysdale. And they had to tuck their heads between their knees and go back to work and didn't get anything.
This honestly reminds me very much of that early industrial revolution labor we talked about. Anyway, this has been great. Thank you so much for coming. I'll hang around if you want to ask me questions afterwards. But before you go, I wanted to announce there's going to be a couple of events. There's going to be a memorial service and solidarity vigil at Congregation Beth Shalom on Tuesday at 6:30. And there's going to be another presentation by Trudy Mazer, who's a registered nurse for many years, about elder abuse and keeping our loved ones safe. That's going to be the next talk at KOH. On March 2nd, and then there'll be follow-up on March 30th, and more events in June. If you want details, I've got the info right here. Thank you guys so much for coming. It's been a real pleasure. I'm sorry we shot so much over the time limit.
Thank you.